It was the fall of 1974, and I walked the crowded marketplace of Baltimore with my head down and my hands half extended, not fully begging, but no longer pretending I wasn't desperate, moving from one vendor to another with the silent dignity of a man who had once been something and now barely existed, not because he had committed some crime or brought shame upon his name, but because history, he moved on without him, leaving only dust, silence, and a name that no longer stirred recognition in the ears of passers-by. There was a time when I had worn a U.S. Army uniform with pride, Captain John Baran, decorated after the Italian campaign, proud recipient of a Silver Star for actions during the Battle of Monte Cassino, a place where the sky itself seemed to burn and men disappeared into smoke. But that name, that face, that chapter of my life had been folded away like the flag I was given after my brother was killed in Anzio. Stored in a box, no on. He ever opened, not even me. After the war, I had returned to a country that wanted victory but not its veterans, especially not the ones who had fought under foreign command, carried the scars of European battlefields, or questioned the government's new direction. I had joined the war as a son of Polish immigrants, hoping to honor both my birth country and the land that had taken my family in, and yet when I came home, all I found were locked doors, short interviews, quiet refusals, and eventually, silence. I had drifted from job to job, dock work, warehouse shifts, night watchman posts, until one day someone found an old newspaper clipping with my name and photo, and just like that, I was let go without cause. I never married. The woman who had once promised to wait for me, a kind-hearted nurse from Pennsylvania I had met through letters during the war, died of illness before she ever knew I made it back alive. There was no funeral for what we lost, just absence. So I came to the market day after day, where people passed me like wind around a stone, sometimes leaving spare change, most times just averting their gaze. I never asked for money outright. I still had that little bit of pride left. But I carried one object with me, deep in the inner pocket of my coat, wrapped in cloth, like a secret too painful to show. My Silver Star, the one thing no one could take from me, though God knows many tried. And then one morning, while reaching to pick up a bruised apple that had rolled into the street, my torn coat gave way, and I heard a sound I hadn't heard in years, the soft metallic chime of the metal as it hit the pavement. Before I could react, a boy, maybe 9 years old, face dirty with city dust, darted forward and picked it up. He turned to me with a look I hadn't seen in decades. Not pity, not fear, just curiosity. He asked, "Mister, is this yours?" And in that moment, 1 second, one question, everything I thought was lost began to return. If this story touches you the way it touched me in writing it, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep telling stories that move, inspire, and awaken something deep in all of us. And now, prepare yourself, because what comes next will change everything. After the war ended, I expected parades, a steady job, maybe a handshake from someone in uniform who understood what we had left behind on those foreign shores. But instead, I returned to a country that had changed while I was away. Or maybe it had never truly seen me as part of it to begin with, because what I found was not gratitude or understanding, but paperwork that vanished, calls that were never returned, and an unspoken message everywhere I went. There was no place for men like me anymore. I had fought as part of a joint unit, Polish-American volunteers integrated into Allied command, which at the time had seemed like a symbol of cooperation, a testament to the shared cause against fascism. But back in Baltimore, those credentials were viewed with suspicion, even disdain, as if fighting for a cause that stretched beyond borders made me suspect in a nation now obsessed with post-war conformity and domestic allegiance. I tried, at first, to be normal. I took a job unloading ships at the harbor, the kind of backbreaking work I had sworn I would never return to after crawling through the rubble of Monte Cassino. And for a while, no one asked questions. No one cared who I had been, and that suited me fine, because I had seen enough death to know that the past could be both a badge and a burden. But then someone, recognized me, not my face, but my name, from an old write-up in the Stars and Stripes newspaper, and the next day I was told there had been a miscommunication and that they no longer needed my labor. That was the last time I applied for a job under my own name. Over the years I lived in corners, a rented basement here, a cot in a boarding house there, sleeping sometimes in shelters, sometimes in alleys, never long enough in one place to gather belongings or build friendships. I became an expert in invisibility, wearing neutral colors, speaking only when spoken to, never correcting people when they called me old man instead of captain. The truth was, I had begun to forget who I had been too. I still had one box, a shoebox wrapped in twine, weathered by time and transit, and inside it were the few relics that tied me to a life that had, by all visible measures, disappeared. A faded photo of my unit under the Italian sun, a letter I had never mailed to Anna, the nurse from Scranton who used to write to me every week and told me once that she had dreamed of naming our first child Joseph after my father, and of course the medal, the Silver Star, dulled now by age but still intact, still heavy in the palm of my hand whenever I dared to take it out and remember. I never told anyone about Anna, not about the letters, not about the ring I had bought with my last stipend overseas, the one I never gave her because the war dragged on and the mail never reached its destination. One day, the letters stopped coming, and when I returned home and went to the hospital where she had worked, I was told she had passed. No details, no records, just a name on a list of nurses who had died during the influenza outbreak in '46. I left without asking questions. I didn't think I could survive the answers. The box remained with me through every move, every eviction, every shelter. It was all I carried, the one thing that reminded me that once I had been something more than what people now saw. A thin, tired man in a second-hand coat who walked as though he was still marching up that mountain in Italy. Sometimes at night when the city fell quiet, I would take the medal out and hold it in my hands, feeling the weight, not just of the object, but of every friend I had buried, every cry I had silenced, every act of courage that no one remembered but me, and I would wonder whether any of it had mattered, whether I had fought for a country that knew how to remember or only how to forget. There were days when I sat on the bench in the park and watched children play, wondering if any of them might be mine, not in blood perhaps, but in spirit, or in the echo of the life I never lived. And I told myself that if I had helped preserve their freedom, then it had to count for something. But even that hope grew quiet over time. The world had moved on. The city had rebuilt itself with new people, new dreams, new wars. And I became, in every sense of the word, a remnant, a walking footnote in a history that no one asked to read. Yet even as I faded, I never let go of the medal. I didn't wear it. I didn't flaunt it. But I kept it, like a secret prayer, tucked close to my heart, the last proof that I had once lived, fought, and loved, even if no one remembered. It was a Thursday morning, grey and brittle with the kind of wind that cuts through layers no matter how many you wear, and I had gone to the market the same way I always did, not to buy anything, because I rarely had the money for more than a cup of weak coffee or a bruised apple from the edge of a bin, but because the crowd made me feel like I still belonged to the world, if only as background noise. And as I shuffled past a table of second-hand books, I spotted a fruit rolling toward the gutter, fallen from some child's grip, and without thinking, I bent to pick it up, my knees cracking like old hinges. And in that small motion, something shifted inside the worn lining of my coat. I didn't notice it immediately. I was too focused on not falling, on getting my balance, but then I heard it. A soft metallic clink against the sidewalk, like a coin dropped in a cathedral, a sound so precise it stopped me in my tracks. And when I turned, there it was, my silver star, lying face up on the cold pavement, exposed for the first time in years, not to my own trembling hands, but to the eyes of strangers who didn't know what it meant, and perhaps never would, except one. A boy, couldn't have been more than 9 or 10, darted forward before I could move, his small hands quick and curious, and when he picked up the medal, something in his expression changed. Not because he knew what it was, but because he understood that it wasn't just a piece of metal, and as he turned toward me, his fingers still wrapped around it like it might disappear, he asked softly, "Is this yours?" And for a moment I couldn't speak, because the question wasn't about the medal, not really, but about whether I still had a name, a story, a place in the world. And it had been so long since anyone had looked at me like that, with eyes that didn't flinch or pity, just wondered, that I didn't trust myself to answer. Before I could decide, a man, his father I assumed, stepped up behind him, tall and lean, with the rough hands of a laborer and a face drawn by years of trying to do right with too little, and he took the medal gently from the boy, turned it over in his palm, read the inscription, and then looked at me with a sudden stillness that made the rest of the market disappear. He asked, "You served?" in a voice that wasn't skeptical, but quiet, respectful, like he already knew the answer and needed to hear it from me, and I nodded, unable to say the words, because they had been buried for so long beneath hunger and dirt and the relentless ache of being forgotten. He didn't ask for details. He didn't question me. He just looked at me, then at the medal, and then he did something I didn't expect. He said, "Come eat with us." I remember standing there, stunned, my hand outstretched more to steady myself than anything else, because I couldn't remember the last time someone had invited me into their home without suspicion, without strings, without the need for me to prove I was worth the seat, and everything in me wanted to decline, to retreat into the safety of my invisibility. But something about the boy's face, Saint, still holding my gaze with that quiet, earnest waiting, made me nod. Their apartment was only a few blocks away, in a weathered brick building near the waterfront, with squeaky stairs and an old Polish flag hanging faded in the hallway. And when we stepped inside, the warmth hit me like a memory, the kind that opens a door you didn't realize you had locked. The smell of soup simmering, the creak of wood beneath worn rugs, the cluttered table with a chipped cerami, icy bowl full of sugar packets and crayons. The boy's mother greeted me with a hesitant smile, one eye on her husband, as if trying to gauge whether I was trouble. And when he gave the faintest nod, she poured an extra bowl of soup and set it in front of me without a word. And there I sat, in their kitchen, hands shaking slightly as I lifted the spoon, unsure whether it was the heat or the moment that made them tremble. And for the first time in years, I tasted something real, something that wasn't scavenged or handed to me in a plastic cup. I didn't mean to speak, but the words came anyway. I told them about the war, not all of it, not the worst parts, but enough. The marches, the friends I lost, the cold nights in the Apennines, the letter from Anna I kept folded in my shirt even after it tore. And when I said her name, the father looked up, not with surprise, but with a strange kind of recognition that he didn't explain. The boy said nothing, just listened, his elbows on the table, his chin in his hands, the way I once used to sit when my father told me stories of the old country. And when I finally stopped talking, afraid I had said too much, no one filled the silence with polite words or questions. They just let the silence be, and in that silence, for the first time in decades, I felt seen. In the days that followed, I found myself returning to their home not out of need, but out of something I hadn't felt in decades. Belonging, or at least the faint outline of it. Something I could reach toward cautiously, like a man testing the strength of ice beneath his feet, unsure if it would hold the weight of all the years he had carried in silence. They never asked me for more stories, never pressured me for details, but they listened, truly listened, when I spoke. And that kind of listening, the kind that comes without judgment or interruption, is a rare and sacred thing, especially for someone who had spent a lifetime being dismissed or ignored or, worse, erased. One evening I brought with me a small box, the same box I had carried through every shelter, every alley, every forgotten corner of the city where I had laid my head. A simple, battered container that held the only things I had left from the world before everything broke apart. 2 photographs, a torn notebook, a dog tag on a rusted chain, and a bundle of letters tied with a piece of blue string. The paper yellowed and soft at the edges from age and weather, and too many nights gripped in hands that could no longer write back. I handed the box to the boy's mother. She had a gentle way of unfolding things, both words and paper, like nothing was ever truly lost as long as someone took the time to open it. And she untied the letters with care, choosing one near the middle, dated November 1945, and began to read aloud in a voice so steady it could have been my own heart speaking back to me after all these years. "My dearest John," the letter began, "I don't know if you're alive. I don't know if you'll ever see these words, but I write them as if you will, because it is the only way I know how to keep breathing. Our son is growing fast. He has your eyes, your way of looking serious even when he's laughing. And sometimes I catch him standing in the doorway just like you did that last morning. I tell him stories about you. I tell him you are brave and kind and that one day he will understand why you had to go." She stopped reading. The room was very quiet. I stared at the table, not breathing, not blinking, trying to process the word that echoed in my ears. Son. A word I had never heard spoken in relation to me, a word that had been taken from me before I ever knew it existed, stolen by a war that swallowed mail and years and people and chances. I looked up and asked softly, "What did you say his name was?" She looked at her husband. He said nothing at first, then stood up, walked over to the box, and picked up the rest of the letters, flipping through them with the slow, careful movements of someone who already knew what he was looking for, but needed proof just the same. And when he came to the final letter, the one at the very bottom, he handed it to me without a word. It was addressed to Anna Zielinski. The name hit me like a blow to the chest, not because I didn't expect it, but because a part of me had always hoped that maybe, somehow, she had survived, had built a life, had smiled again. And now I knew that she had, and that I had been part of it without ever knowing. I asked, "Your mother's name?" It was Anna Zielinski. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when saying yes to something that changes everything. "She told me once," he said, "that my father died in the war, but she never had proof, just a feeling, just silence. She said if he had lived, he would have come back." I didn't speak. I couldn't. Because the truth was, I had tried, I had written, I had asked, I had gone to the last address I had for her, only to be met with a closed door and neighbors who shrugged and said she had moved, that no one knew where or why or with whom, and I had given up, assuming as any man would after so much time and distance and grief that the story had ended without me. But now, sitting at this table, looking into the eyes of a man who had my nose, my hands, my way of folding and unfolding his fingers when nervous, I realized the story hadn't ended at all. It had merely gone quiet. I reached across the table, not for the letters, not for the medal, not for proof, but for his hand. And when he took mine, I said the words that had been building in my chest like a storm for nearly 30 years. I never knew about you. If I had, I swear to God, I would have come. He didn't cry. I did. And in that moment, he said something so simple, so unguarded, that it broke me more than any battlefield ever had. "You're here now." And for the first time in my life, those words, "you're here now," felt like a kind of redemption I had stopped believing was possible. That night, after we put the letters away, after the children had gone to bed and the apartment grew quiet in that way only homes do, when the lights dim and everyone retreats into their own reflections, he and I remained at the kitchen table, not as strangers anymore, and not quite yet as father and son, but as two men who had found each other across the wreckage of time, piecing together a story neither of us had the full words for until now. We didn't talk for a while, just sat there with chip mugs of tea and the slow hum of the old refrigerator in the background, the air between us thick with questions neither of us knew how to ask. Because what could I say to make up for 30 years of silence? What sentence could carry the weight of decades lost, birthdays missed, a childhood I never even knew was mine to grieve? But he broke the silence first, not with blame, not with bitterness, but with a quiet honesty that only made his words hit harder. My mom used to talk about you, he said. Not often, but when she did, it was always with this softness. Like saying your name reminded her of something she didn't want to lose. He reached for the packet of letters again, not to read, but just to hold them, the way people hold photographs of someone they miss, not for what's written or seen, but for what it represents. She said you were brave, that you went off to fight and never came back, but that if you were alive, you'd have tried. I didn't know if I believed her. I guess part of me always thought she was just protecting me from the truth. And I wanted to tell him everything right then, about the train stations and wrong addresses, the returned letters, and the silence that followed, about the days I walked through unfamiliar towns, hoping to see her face in a window, about the moment I gave up, not out of indifference, but from sheer exhaustion. But I didn't. Instead, I said the only thing that mattered. She was right. I would have come. He nodded once, eyes focused somewhere beyond me, and then he said, I don't blame you. I used to, but not anymore. And it was in that moment, not when I found the medal, not when I saw the letters, not even when he said I was his father, that something truly shifted, because that forgiveness offered without being asked was more than I had ever hoped for. From that night on, things changed, slowly but surely. They cleared out the spare room and filled it with a bed, a set of fresh clothes, even a bookshelf stocked with old military biographies and American history paperbacks. A quiet gesture, I think, to say they saw me, not as a charity case, not as a guest, but as someone who belonged. The kids started calling me Grandpa John, at first shyly, like they weren't sure if the title fit, and then more confidently, as if by saying it enough times, they could erase all the years I had missed and write me into their story anyway. I took walks with them on Saturdays, down to the harbor or through Patterson Park, telling stories that I had kept locked up for so long I wasn't sure I still remembered them. About the GIs who played harmonicas in foxholes, about a German soldier who offered me a cigarette before we took him prisoner, about how once a stray dog saved my life by barking before a sniper fired. They listened the way children do when they sense that the truth is heavier than it sounds. My son, I still stumble saying that out loud, would sit with me in the evenings, usually after the kids were asleep, and we would talk not just about the war, but about life, how he met his wife, what it was like growing up without a father, the kind of man he had become because of it, or in spite of it. He asked if I regretted anything. I said I regretted everything, but he shook his head and said, then we wouldn't be sitting here now. And that line stayed with me. That idea that everything terrible, all the silence and ache and missed chances had somehow led to this moment, to this living room, to this warmth I never thought I'd feel again. And for once in my life, I didn't feel like a relic or a forgotten name in a government archive. I felt like a man, not a ghost, not a shadow. A man with a past, yes, but also, for the first time in a long time, a future. Today, the medal no longer lives in the torn pocket of an old coat, hidden between layers of dust and shame, buried like a memory I was too afraid to carry in the open. Instead, it rests inside a simple wooden frame on a shelf in my son's home, right beside two photographs. One, black and white, shows me in uniform standing beside Anna, taken on the only day we ever had together before the war took everything. The other, in color, captures a different moment entirely. Me, sitting in the backyard, laughing with grandchildren I never imagined I'd meet, surrounded by the kind of noise and warmth I used to watch from a distance and convince myself I didn't need anymore. I still walk past the old market sometimes, the same place where that medal once clattered to the pavement like an accusation, where a little boy's question cracked open a lifetime of silence I thought would bury me. And when I pass the stalls now, it isn't as a ghost or a beggar or a man hoping to be ignored, but as someone who was seen, remembered, and brought back to life by something as small. L as a child's gaze and the courage to ask, "Is this yours?" People don't look away anymore. Sometimes they even smile. They nod at me, not because they know who I was, but because I look like someone who belongs. And in truth, I finally do. I once believed that the war had taken everything from me. Not just my youth or my friends or the woman I loved, but my right to exist in the story of this country. My right to say, I was there, I mattered, I helped build what you now enjoy. For years, I thought that if no one remembered, then maybe it never really happened. But memory is strange like that. It doesn't always live in grand monuments or history books or engraved plaques. Sometimes it lives in shoeboxes beneath beds, in letters read at kitchen tables, in eyes that look at you and recognize something you forgot was even inside you. And sometimes, if you're lucky, memory lives on in the children who ask questions, who listen, who carry your stories not as burdens, but as inheritance. These days, I tell my grandchildren stories not just of war, but of love and regret, and the strange miracle of being given a second chance. And they listen, wide-eyed, laughing when I make jokes, leaning in when I grow quiet, as if they understand, even in their young hearts, that not every grandfather starts at the beginning of the book. Some enter halfway through. Some are found in the footnotes, but all of us have something to give. I no longer hide my past. I no longer shrink from the years I lost. Because what I have now is not just a family, it's a future that includes me. And though I spent decades begging not for coins, but for recognition, for proof that I hadn't disappeared completely, I now understand that what I was truly asking for wasn't charity. It was memory, forgiveness, a place in someone's story. And somehow, against the odds, against time, against silence, I was given all of that, not through ceremony, not through recognition from any government or parade, but through a simple moment at a market, a boy's outstretched hand, and the quiet strength of a family who chose to see me, not as I was, but as I could still become. Because sometimes, what war takes from you, life gives back, not all at once, and not in the way you expected, but exactly when you're ready to receive it. We publish new stories every day, real voices that move and inspire. If this one touched you, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue sharing stories that matter.